Sam, how are you? You doing all right?
Yeah, good.
Oh,
How are
fantastic.
you? I hope you guys had an amazing Christmas and New Year's.
We did, Sam. I appreciate it. So, Michelle, we had the tree bring things to mind. I certainly enjoyed last week talking about memory is spirit. Like, not just metaphorically, but literally memory, whatever we do in our mind is actually spirit. I think that's a very helpful framing. And I do definitely think we create categorical distinctions between what we do when we think between imagination, memory, thinking that are actually ultimately arbitrary relative to the mental act itself, and that this actually contributes to sort of concealing what exactly is memory. And it's too past coded. It's not eternity coded enough. And I think that that gets into Bergson, obviously, and that has been perhaps held us back from really understanding what's going on. And it does make me think, like we talked about with Aspasia, like if you really took seriously that inner voice inside of you was speaking with God always, that it was always the act of prayer, which I think we sometimes forget that when many of these new religions are starting, the written word, writing is not so common. They're more of an oral tradition in the way that Ong would talk about. So the formation of the inner space is phenomenologically newer. And that would be experienced as a kind of foreign voice that might have a spiritual quality to us. So perhaps we've sort of lost sight. We've over domesticated the inner of ourselves. We've over domesticated, we've become overly familiar with it, and therefore we're not really taken by the surprise of it in the way that would perhaps re-enchant us in new ways. But a few things. What you're saying about family, Michelle and I think about all the time. And out of those relations, I think also this question of the motions of doing it again versus the opportunity to do something new. It makes me think of the question of doing anything new or changing anything, and the balance between changing things to create something new or changing things that just make it chaotic and noisy, right? And actually, Sam, I'm glad you're here because I've been reading a book, and I'll throw it to Michelle here. So I've been asking the question. Um, Obviously with belonging, again, we have this notion of this possibility of spreading some sort of subjectivity that is able to deal with, say, quote unquote, global pluralism, otherness, and stuff like that. But of course, there's always the problem of scale, right? Well, this lovely book, so I'm always interested in theories of leading to change, which I think is relative to New Year's, that are not going to fall into nudging protocols. And so there was this lovely book called Seeing Nature by Paul Krafel. Sam, I was thinking about you the entire time I was reading this book. Also, I've been reading that in this. I don't know if this Belonging Again 2.2 is way too long. So now it's probably going to be 2.5.9 or 3 or whatever. But there's a section that wants to talk about this wonderful thinker, Tyson Yucaporta, Sand Talk. This is a wonderful book. And also the great Charles Einstein with Sacred Economics. And all three of these texts basically, I think obviously they're environmental, but they're also getting into stuff like complexity. And I'll just mention Mr. Krafel because I think he's also getting into the stuff of like the meta geometry that I'm obsessed with. But so far, he makes his example toward the end of the book, where so you have this flow of water going down a hill, and how if you make a slight adjustment in how the water flows, you can kind of reverse erosion, right? And you do this at the beginning, and then over the years, whereas all of the water and erosion would have gone to the bottom of the hill, and then taken a whole lot of heavy equipment, whole lot of energy to move the topsoil and so on and so forth by making this slight change with a shovel. And it's the chapter called The Test toward the end of Seeing Nature by Paul Krafel. Mr. Jockin, thank you for coming, sir. Always good to see you. He's talking about how, because of this small change, you're able to actually save a whole lot of work and energy that you would have had to have used otherwise by simply letting nature run its course, right? And ultimately, he's going to be describing how, in a way, this is an example where work creates possibility. And he's asking this question in light of the law of thermodynamics. Because it would seem in a way that the right intervention of the human being in nature can, in a way, reverse thermodynamics, but of course not reversing thermodynamics. You're in a way you're actually, the way he describes it, I really like how he says this. And this makes me think of Charles Einstein when he talks about humans as stewards, stewardship, and maybe Clayton will pop on because we use that word to his great paper, right? And also it makes me think of sand talk. So basically, and also what he talks about the fit in this book, how evolution, because we often forget that evolution is not really the strongest survive, but who is most fitting for the environment, right? And that's really important because that means evolution is actually symbiotic. It's a relational activity. It's not like what determines being the strongest is relative to quote unquote the environment, right? Like the fit. And I've also been thinking about fit relative to the classical notions of form and also Adam Smith's invisible hand, because I think we need to read Adam Smith's work on astronomy to really understand what he means by invisible hand. And it's a little more interesting, and I think actually ties back to this notion of the classical idea of kind of orbit and form. But anyway, the way that Mr. Krafel, and we can talk about anything on this fine day, but this is what I've been thinking about, is that he kind of asked this question. As I reflect on this sense of fit, I begin seeing the second law of thermodynamics as posing a test to each evolving species. Can you find a path that does not consume possibilities faster than they are created? So the whole idea of the second law of thermodynamics, it means it's a kind of restraint that says whatever work you do must create more possibility than it uses. And Aspasia, wonderful to see you. So rather than the second law of thermodynamics necessitating the loss of possibility, it sets a restraint that creates possibility. It says whenever you do work, make sure it creates more possibility than it uses up. And what Krafel is saying is that there are particular activities you can do in nature that open up possibilities and in a way create negentropy, reverse the second law, that because they create more possibilities than they use up, okay? And that this creates a more complicated system, right? So the question that I have for like the question of spread, and I think this does have implications for if we want to have New Year's resolutions where we actually change, what kind of change actually leads to long-term change? Well, it has to be a change that creates more possibility than it uses up. Like that would be kind of the practical implication, that any work you do uses up less possibilities in that work than what it opens up. And the key variable here is therefore small little changes you make that then begin what Krafel calls an upward spiral through time, where in a way time does the rest of the work. You make a small foundational shift that then time does the rest of the work. So in a way, time reverses the second law of thermodynamics in this weird way. Like if you make a little shift foundationally, and then you let time run its course, and of course time is inseparable from the cycles of nature, that this actually creates more possibility than was used up, right? So what are the small little changes we can make in our little New Year's that then through time will actually lead to upward spirals that create negentropy versus downward spirals, as he calls it, that leads to well, self-effacement, ultimately. All of this on a systems level then is in the question, what is the difference between what Krafel is talking about and nudging, nudge theory, that Jockin and I have spoken about, the great, Eckenmancer and I have talked about. Like when you say, okay, we want to make sure that more people eat healthy or go to the dentist. So the government creates a nudge system to nudge people to go to the dentist, right? I think that's really problematic because who decides what is the goods we're going to nudge everyone toward? What are kind of the stimulants we put in place to nudge people? And it creates this sort of idea, well, we're not violating freedom, we're just nudging people, right? I think Daniel Frege called it totalitarianism light. He said it's light totalitarianism or something. Made me laugh. He said that in ontological design. So there's this kind of nudging, but that seems very, very different than what Krafel is talking about, or ultimately what Einstein is talking about, or Tyson and Sandtalk, right? Like these symbiotic relationships to nature or environments where you make small shifts that then give rise to more complexity, right? Or that give rise to more possibilities. So what is the difference between what Krafel is talking about in nudging? Because for me, this is, to look at belonging again, this is a really important question for how the spread of childhood, the address, is not actually a form of nudging in disguise. right? Because we don't want nudging. And yet you want some sort of environmental stimulation, some sort of environmental parameters that lead to a change in favor of the beautiful versus the good. Now, you could argue the distinction, of course, is that nudging is based on the good, whereas what Krafel is talking about is an environment based on the beauty, and also what Krafel is talking about is more open-ended, right? That stewardship has a certain open-endedness to it. I think this is also very important because, like in speaking, and I'll throw it to Michael here, when you speak about family drama or people that say have short tempers or like that create drama, should we nudge them to being better people? Well, that seems problematic and totalitarianism light, and perhaps not what you learn to do in therapy. You're as a therapist, you're not supposed to nudge people into being better. And yet, in a way, you are, and yet in another way, you're not. It seems like you're trying to do something like Krafel is saying. Encourage the person to make a small change fundamentally that then through time leads to a feedback loop upward, a spiral upward versus downward. So I've been thinking about the difference between Krafel and nudge a lot, and then people not fighting. But Michael, let me throw it to you.
It's good to see everyone and Happy New Year's. Wherever you are in the world, it might be the second already for you, Aspasia. I don't know what time it is where you are, but yeah, it's lovely to be
7
here.
a.m. 7 a.m.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. Nice to be
Bright and
nice
early.
to be in the picture. Yeah.
Yeah. This is this is kind of around a lot of things that I've been thinking about too. And something that came to mind when you were speaking, Daniel, about the difference between kind of these small changes that kind of have this upward effect. It made me think of this morning I was in Jacob Kashir's Resonant Man Circle, and this month's theme is the sacred fire. And so we were kind of talking about what is fire, like both from kind of like an elemental perspective as well as kind of like a practical utilitarian perspective, and then like what does it mean to harness and wield and experience fire in kind of like a sacred context. And it was grounded in like the spirit of dialogos, which like goes back to Heraclitus, who talked about the logos, the word, being akin to a fire. And something that like I would hear John Vervaeke talking about with dialogos is kind of like, that like the propositional arguments are kind of like the kindling, like you're placing twigs and things that can catch on fire through your speech and through your words. But then the kind of experience of coming together and having kind of in that like alchemical field, and like what then transpires is kind of this fire that has a life of its own that transcends any of the speakers themselves, and kind of has this like exponentially growing capacity, it seems. But if you're in a container with people who are tracking that and are kind of like stalking the same thing, it doesn't become destructive, and it doesn't become like chaotic. It becomes generative and like structured giving. And so I was just thinking of that in light of what you said, Daniel. And it seems like the difference between nudging and that is kind of, to borrow another Vervaeke term, like the bottom up emergence as opposed to the top down, right? Like nudging is very top down imposition of structure that kind of has this value label of like, this is good and this should be imposed, as opposed to this kind of discovery on a individual or like micro communal level that then scales and isn't beholden to market forces or even kind of like this like evaluation of like, oh, this is good. Like, it's, again, I think it originates from the beautiful being the like the kind of guiding principle. And it just makes me think of like what we discussed last week, and kind of like what I've just been dealing in my personal life with with deciding to leave this job, and kind of that language, Daniel, of nudging, like it definitely rings true with what I'm asked to do in this job, which we passed this policy proposal to ban plastic bags in farmers markets that we manage. And we've been going out and speaking with vendors about like their bag use habits, and kind of like what the potential consequences or fallout could be if plastic bags are banned, and how to like make the transition as easy as possible. And like we've gotten a lot of pushback from people who have been using plastic for decades, and there's like all sorts of reasons why, financial, practical, for a lot of different products. And it's been really like unsettling and uncomfortable to like be hired on, not really having like industry experience, and then now being like, you got to change because the turtles, like and it's like we all know, like the world would be a better place without plastic. And so like on one hand, it's you're armed with that kind of data and the environmental costs and all of that, but on another hand, it's like you're telling people who have been doing this for far longer than you have, right? And if anyone's had experience talking to farmers, they notoriously do not like change. They do not like changing habits, for better or for worse. And it feels like one big nudge, and it doesn't feel like there's a space to even consider like, yes, plastic is bad, and this is an incredibly complex thing to just kind of do away with. Like there's all sorts of fallout, as opposed to I don't know, cultivating a spirit of like reciprocity in agriculture, and sustainability is kind of like it's thrown around a lot, but like the spirit of like taking and receiving, and then that scaling up, and then people being like, like, do I need to be using plastic, or can I use something reusable, right? As opposed to like, oh, this is bad, this is good, you got to change, effective immediately, but anyways, now I'm rambling. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
You're not rambling at all. And in fact, I think that's getting at the key problems. And I love the plastic bag example because that's a real live example. So to me, all of this is pointing to the problem of change, right? And look, the notion that nudging doesn't work, just think over the holidays if you had a relative nudging you to do something different. Not telling you, but nudging you, and how much that pisses you off and doesn't work. Nobody likes nudging, right? So what's the difference between the person nudging you and the person who opens up horizons that inspire you, right? So if there's a distinction here between the Krafel method, which to me is a slight fundamental change that opens up complexity where the environment does not feel nudged, like the environment does something it kind of didn't even know it could do, right? Which I think many of these thinkers like Einstein, et cetera, are pointing to, versus nudging, versus top-down, right? These all seem very different. And I'll throw it to Sam here. Another reason I'm very interested in this is because we've been speaking a bit about liberalism and how everyone hates liberalism now. And I would argue that there was, at the birth of liberalism, quite an argument and quite a debate. And there are many forms of liberalism. And I think most of the time when I listen to Dugin or Land or whoever talking about the evils of liberalism, I feel as if their liberalism often reflects, I want to say, the utilitarian side, which was the notion that the form of government is basically the good is the increase of happiness, right? Like very simplistic increase of utility, right? Well, there's another form of liberalism that was the idea that we want the limit, like you could associate it with federalism. I always go to Russell Kirk because to me, he had a very clear vision of, I think Russell Kirk had a clear vision that liberalism was about preserving spaces of social imagination that had the most limited form of government possible so that we weren't all just fragmented. But then there was no, but it was not a liberalism that said that we have no interest in people's social and moral imagination. We actually have a broad range and environment to cultivate many moral imaginations. And we have a form of government that is limited as much as possible for that cultivation. And actually, the reason you want small government is because you want, is not for, like, let's put it this way. Most conservatives now say the point of small government is for small business to thrive. Someone like Kirk would say, no, the point of small government is so that you have local communities in which imagination can be incubated. That actually it's about small spaces of particularity where imagination comes alive, because imagination creates creativity that then actually that's what creates wealth, not merely the stimulation of demand. Also, I've been reading this book that won the Nobel, Power and Progress, and I've known about it and read it that talk about the solar residue, and there's all this idea that it's institutions. Now, but I think the problem, you can see my hesitation. I think the problem is when you say institutions create wealth, you got to make distinctions between the methods of change various institutions make. They're not all the same. Some are, I'm just going to call it the Krafel method, small changes in the environment. Some of them are nudges. Some of them are top down. Some of them control the metric of quantification to determine when they succeed. So of course they succeed. So you have to look at differences between institutions and environments and all of those different things. But I bring all this up because there are various forms of liberalism, in my opinion, that employ different methods of bringing about social change. And the differences in how to bring about social change really, really matter, because the sweet spot that Russell Kirk is talking about is the possibility of an environment of which does not nudge people, but nevertheless inspires them to bring alive their social imagination and moral vision, bring alive their particular horizon, and do so in a manner that it's able to handle otherness and community, right? Well, bringing alive sounds like what Krafel is talking about, right? And that seems very different from nudging. But of course, then you have to be able to, of course, what Dostoevsky suggested is the reason we don't tend to stay in those small communities is because it's easier to love humanity than an individual. And if you actually have to love individuals, it turns out that's really hard. And we rather go to the abstract man who's all about, like, there's a way in which the form of liberalism based on utilitarianism is what we wanted. We wanted the simplistic idea that the point of the good is increasing utility, because then I don't have to interact with otherness so much. But that isn't the Kirk version. I will pause and throw it to Sam, Michelle, and then Dimitri. Sam, Christian, thank you for coming, sir. Sam.
Hi. Yeah, I wanted to just carry on with what you're saying and just maybe sprinkle a few things on there. I don't really know what else I have to say, but just that I'm very grateful. Like, I find whenever I come back to this space, like, I'm really like re-injected into like the like arrowhead of what I've been trying to think about. And then I think like I come here, I think about things in abstract, and then I'm like pondering them, and I try to bring them into some sort of anecdotal form in my writing. So it's really great to talk to you all. So thank you. And these sound like great books. I will definitely check out Seeing Nature. And the other one, what was that, Daniel? Seeing Nature and The Invisible Hand. Oh, Sandtalk. I've read Sandtalk. It's really good. Yeah, Tyson's great. And I mean, that whole circle of thinkers like Tyson Yonkaporta, Bayo Akamalafe, and like Charles Eisenstein are really, really tender. And I think that's so needed. And actually, just to like bring forward a few more titles, like I was thinking today, just because it's January 1st, like what are the best books that I read in 2025? And I think actually one of them was definitely like The Romance of Reality by Bobby Azarian. And then also I've been reading Irreducible by Federico Fagin. And I think they're all like, all of these authors I feel like are really like sharing in different angles of what we're talking about here today. Systems complexity, time has changed. I think it's like Bergson really maybe took Western analytical philosophy and also Western science and sort of swerved it off in the direction that has now led to like the West, like, I don't know, like reimagining itself in this kind of more widely inclusive way, and that embraces both its highest achievements of thought in regards to both the inner and the outer, and trying to like bridge the two. Yeah, and so like I think that is really important. Michael, when you were talking about how we'd be better off without plastic and like, like I think the reason that we think about these things is that we see what's going wrong in the world, and like all of volume 1 of Belonging Again was like a sort of look at like, okay, we definitely know things are going wrong, but why are they going wrong? How are they going wrong? Like, why can't we just not do plastic? Like, but then I think that there's like this there's like this external problem, let's say, which is plastic, right? And then there's our relationship as subjects towards it, which is this tension of frustration. It's like we've discovered these sort of like, these biological implications of this compound, and like it creates the sense of like, we know we would all be better off without plastic, but like plastic is just like another form in the visionary medium of matter, and like we've chosen it, like it was through our conscious acts and like conscious free intention that we've created this form of particles. Like it's not bad, it's just a form, it's just a form of a human choice, and it's really linked to us, and we extricate it as a bad thing, but it's like it is us, it's like our byproduct, like we need only to change us and it will change also. Like and there's something in us that like has the freedom to solve the problem, which is just to find some conceptual framework for action, which will, like change that form of particles, which will, literally like alchemize the world materially, and, we'll have new forms of particles, right? Like we created all this plastic, we can uncreate it. Maybe an animal can uncreate it. Like there's, forms of changing the world. And we just need to like, sometimes it's just so simple. Like we just need to find the concept that opens the affordance. But like, I find that our sort of like, our tension towards the problem and Bayo Kamalafe talks about this, like our response to crisis is the crisis. Like the tension, the anger, the frustration we feel about plastic almost prevents us from solving the problem of plastic, which is the problem of who we are and what we do. And another thing that like something that I've been thinking about in this whole complex of issues is like just on an epistemological level, like I think we really like I've been sort of toying with the idea that like and this sort of like comes from, I think this is initially actually like a Bergsonian insight, is that we're always mistaking traces for forces, like, and I think this is evident in what you're saying about memory, Daniel, like, like we think that our body is a mechanism. It's like a collection of mechanisms, but it has this inherent freedom to it. And it's that freedom which the body is a byproduct of, is like a mechanical tracing of. And I think this relates again to what Federico Fegin talks about, because he's making an epistemological distinction between information as knowing. Like he says, like machines know. They know directly. It's not mediated by anything. You can write the information in a machine that knows things in like precise ways. Like, and I think that's a great metaphor too, just like the way that like when we know facts, it sort of has like a gear like cascade, like certain facts beget other facts. And that sort of is maybe at heart like a mathematical knowing. But then he distinguishes this from semantic knowledge, and he's saying like knowledge is not knowing. Knowledge only occurs in a conscious subject. And like he also then divides that into direct and indirect semantic knowledge. And so what's really interesting there is like he defines direct semantic knowledge as the subject reflecting on itself. So like only humans can have that. And then indirect semantic knowledge as like the things we garner about the world through our senses, but which are nonetheless always like up to question. And then when you have the direct semantic knowledge, you may make those questions like, do I know that I know? Or maybe I don't know. I know that I don't know that I know. Anyways, in the confusion of traces and forces, it's like, I think we sometimes we have this indirect semantic knowledge of traces of freedoms in the world, which might be plastic. And then we forget that we have this direct semantic knowledge and this choice and this freedom and this conscious subject that is more than just informational knowing and the machines that beget the plastic molecules. And we sort of bind ourselves to the world of indirect semantic knowledge. And we say, this is all that is because it's all that I can see. And the West does this. But I think the romance, like the neo-romantic spirit, or like that kind of Bobby Azarian like proposes to us in The Romance of Reality, is like, no, there's like these are like nested, cascading, like spiraling, opening freedoms, affordances, and like actually like, yeah, like we need not, I think if there's something New Year's-y about what I'm trying to say here, which isn't the most coherent thing I've ever said, but it's that like, yeah, change is possible and each new year is exactly new, and like we may spiral outwards. We just need to like let go of that, like that solid grip we have on what was and the traces that we find, and remember that like, oh yeah, I am a body and it will die, but like I am creating it in every breath that I breathe and the way that I breathe it, Anyways, that's what I got. Thank you.
Fan-friggin-tastic. Happy New Year.
Happy New
No,
Year.
happy friggin' New Year. Well, you said a lot there that's extremely important. So what you were saying about this notion of affordances, this kind of remembering, oh yeah, we actually can change, right? That seems to be where it is possible to have change that is not reliant on nudging. That's more on the Krafel direction, right? For some reason, this is the question, we tend to go in the direction of away from that. We tend to go away from that, right? Now, some of the reasons can be tied to isness. If I just say what is what is, it's more familiar, it's less scary, it doesn't demand anything of me. If I open up, like in the same way loving humanity is less scary than loving an individual, is like Dostoevsky's point, right? The more you move to the actual, the particular, which I think affords that creative possibility you're describing. Like, because for me, Russell Kirk is saying, yeah, we actually, like when you keep governance to the polis, almost in a very Aristotelian sense, you are more likely to be able to be flexible, anti-fragile in change, because you're able to realistically live in the way that you're describing with that creative affordance and going, well, we can just change things as a community. We don't have to use plastic, right? Or it's not that plastic is bad, it's that it's being overfit or it's being overused, right? Can we adjust it, right? Russell Kirk is suggesting, in my opinion, that the likelihood of being able to even think that and not be afraid to do that is tied to the degree you're able to be particularized, right? But for some reason, liberalism, if you will, tends to go in the direction of larger and larger scale that flattens the particular into the general, then moves toward a systems level, that moves away from particularity into a international movement at the expense of the particular. And I think one of the reasons is because, well, unfortunately, it's hard to get along with people. And it's hard to actually stay particular. And we feel like we're missing out on possibility, right? And also, when you have isness, you get understanding, and that's pleasurable. Now, that understanding is a simulacra, but it feels more understandable, and it feels like I have control, right? To me, a lot of what you're describing is tied to the way, and I'll give it to Michelle and Dimitri here, is tied to the willingness to not have control. This is the weird thing. The Krafel method is a suggestion of transformation by giving up control, having the least amount of possible control. You do a little bit on the hill with your shovel, the least of all possible works, that gives rise to the change that is actually negentropic, that answers the challenge of thermodynamics, as Krafel is saying. And that actually is able to create more possibility than it uses. Because that's basically all of what it's all about. Can you create more possibility than what you used up? That's the Krafel question, right? Russell Kirk would say the vision of liberalism and the claim of liberalism, his version of it, is that the more you stay in the particular, the more you can do that. The more that is actual. And the more you're actually going to even afford the social imagination to not be like, well, we've always used plastic and we have to. And also critically, like you're describing, Michael, the farmer said, like, we can't change anything. Kirk would say, yeah, the more you get to a large scale operation, the more you're going to feel that way. But if you have a local community and you have kind of competition you can more communicate with and change the rules of your competition, well, then you're not going to feel so controlled by the system, right? Because you're at a level of possible negotiation where if all your competitors agree not to use plastic bags, well, then I'm not at a disadvantage, right? But if you're competing with other countries, then you're like, well, I can't, there's no possibility of, like Cadell says, of international coordination, right? And Piketty and all these people, like you can't have international cooperation. So it's like, well, we have to use plastic, right? Kirk would be like, I told you, freaking told you. So the question then becomes, why do we move up the scale where then in order to have change, we have to nudge because we're not actually able to remember creative possibilities, right? Part of it, I think, is what Dostoevsky warns about, is we don't like people. Like, we don't naturally do well with difference, otherness. It's why Tocqueville says democracy falls apart. We hide between our titles. Like, we have to be able to encounter otherness, which gets into all the topics of psychoanalysis. And that this actually, if we can, like, the creative possibilities that I think actually can change things without nuts theory are on the other side of facing negativity, on the other side of actually wrestling with ourselves, right? But there is beauty on that other side. But then, of course, the question is, do you nudge people to be willing to do that? What if people aren't willing to do that? Do you nudge them into doing that? Or what are the environments that need to be created so that they change the conditions of possibility for the environment, right? Do you have an eternal regression problem? There's many things that open up, but I'll pause and throw it to Michelle and then Dimitri here. Michelle, please. And Christian and everyone, Jacob, everything. Thank you all for coming. Michelle.
So yeah, this has all been really great. I really resonated with something Sam shared because it makes me think about how, like I like to study about parenting because obviously, you know, Daniel and I are parents. And so I like to learn more about that. And it got me thinking about how something Sam said about this idea of like, it's our byproduct, right? Like we, you know, this isn't to say that you can't desire to change the outcome, but you have to first acknowledge that what is the case is really just because you are the case, right? Like because you are a certain way or you've made certain choices or you have had certain habits, then this is why there's a certain byproduct, right? And I think about this as it relates to having children, because if you ever see something in their field or something like that, if you notice certain behavior or certain symptomology or whatever, it's often because like you do have to ask yourself, how much is it because of you, like as a parent, as a creator of the environment, like you are part of why you see that. And so it's so important to recognize that because, you know, if we're going to do this Krafel versus nudge thing, the nudge thing is a very easy thing to do. As in like, it's not easy. It's actually usually, I mean, it's easy in that it's our default as humans. Like we don't know how we feel as if we don't realize how much influence we have on reality with what we create in ourselves. So then we just do this thing of like, I see something that I feel is needs to change. And first of all, you know, that's why you have to sit still with like, why do I even think this does need to change? That's not because it won't need to change, but it's just to sit with that question. Can you sit with that question and start to see how it's actually, in some ways, it's like, this is just the result of whatever has been the case. So it's not necessarily good or bad. It's just what it is. It is what is the result. It's a litmus test. It sort of reveals to us something about ourselves, something about our own life, our own choices, our own past. And so, yeah, what's beautiful is that that can feel kind of like incriminating for some, but on another level, it's so empowering because suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, I can affect change through what I create and what I do and understanding my own self so that I don't go around nagging my children or anyone, right? Like nudging/nagging, right? I don't have to do this. I can actually affect change through this inspiration, right? Which does also require something of you. And you may actually require something of other people as well, but it's not in a nagging sense. It's in a structural sense so that like the inspiration can come forth through that structure. And something I read in Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way, because I've been working through that book, is like it just really made me think about this idea of this particularity that kind of keeps coming up but that we're talking about. But she said something about that I thought was really great here, where she said, people frequently believe the creative life is grounded in fantasy. The more difficult truth is that creativity is grounded in reality, in the particular, the focus, the well observed or specifically imagined. And to me, that relates to like what we're talking about, because the reality, like Sam was saying, the reality is that we've essentially created plastics because we felt we needed them. Like we felt that they were helpful. We felt this was like actually at some point a huge, innovation, and this helped XYZ But that in that kind of reality, in that realization of that reality, you can start to realize how much, like, what would actually then create an effective change, like what's behind all of that, and what's kind of at the heart of all of that, in changing and shifting that outcome. And also it kind of just makes you more like humble and understanding to other people, right? Like to not just, to realize that, oh, I guess people use this for good reason. But like, I totally am with you. Like when I was in college, I would be the person like not using the styrofoam boxes and I'd bring in my own like dinner plate, and, then the cafeteria people would be like, we're so sorry, we can't use your dinner plate. And I was like, I don't understand why. Like, I cleaned it, it's clean, but it had liability stuff on it. And, I would like tell myself, like, I'm not going to get a coffee if I don't have my to-go coffee mug thing. So like, that was a limitation I put on myself, but I mean, the beauty and the coolness of this is thinking like, wow, people who do really want to affect change are really taking seriously, like doing things differently. And it's just so like our nature to just be habitually slothful and not want to do anything differently. But the cool thing is that if we did do things differently, so much would be like brought and afforded to us. Like that's another thing Julia Cameron will talk about in The Artist's Way. She'll say like how, you take one step toward the universe and the universe takes like 1,000 steps running back toward you. Like it meets you so far and beyond your imagination and comprehension when you just take one step of faith in the direction of change. And I wanted to share a personal story about this, because thinking about the new year in 2024. Okay, so it's 2 years ago now, but to me, it made me think about what you're saying, Daniel, with Krafel, because there was something that and this is again to Julia Cameron's point, where she talks about like, what is your what? Stop worrying so much about the how and start deciding what is your what. And then the rest is going to start to fall into place. You're saying like time does this for you, Daniel, you're saying. So basically I made this decision that like I really knew I needed to basically confess something to somebody very dear to me. And that was very scary. I really didn't want to do it. There was kind of an element of like, well, why? Like, if they never know, ignorance is bliss. But I really, really knew that it was so important for me to share this thing. And in committing to that, even though I hadn't even done it yet, even in committing to that, I started to have all this energy to like clean the house and like go through cupboards I've not gone through for years that I could have gone through and I hadn't gone through, but now suddenly I have the energy to do this, like it was wild. I was suddenly like cleaning stuff out. This is another part of Julia Cameron's book. Like she'll say how in regaining yourself, you start to clean stuff, like you'll declutter and you'll like make space for new stuff and all of this cool stuff. So I just wanted to say, like, that's what it made me think about, Daniel, when you were talking about that versus the nudging, right? This compelling of change based on kind of I don't know. It's just like this leap of faith that you're like, I know this is, I think this is important. I don't know what this, like, the fear is that I don't know if this is going to do anything good and it might do something bad. So then I'm not going to do it. But what you're feeling on and on and on in your heart that won't let you go is, you need to do this. Face your fears. Open your mouth. Speak what you need to that person. And when like even just committing to that, I felt so much more energy. And then after I did do that, that kind of that big moment of like confession, which was scary, but also really necessary and really healing and really powerful. Like that energy just continued, And I guess it's just like a reminder to myself too of anything that I feel afraid to do or talk about or share or be open about, and obviously with discernment, like who are you sharing these things with? But when you know, and you should do that thing. You need to do that thing. And that to me will inspire change. It's like this commitment is like the structure aspect of it. And then the doing it is like this inspirational breath, the speaking that does the work that then like creates an incredible amount of change. And that's powerful. And a lot of it is just facing your fears, which seems so like basic, but I wanted to kind of give like articulation and examples to what that can look like and how it feels on a phenomenological level to sort of experience this versus the nagging, right? Versus the nagging. The nagging just does, it's a waste of energy, and it usually ends up being power struggly too. So the alternative is to do what you're going to require of yourself. And then you can also start to create structures that do require things of other people, but those things are for the sake of them being able to move in their inspired being as well, as children, for example. So there's a lot more to get into with that, but I want to share that because that's the stuff that came to my mind from what you all shared, and I really appreciate this conversation. So thank you.
No, magnificent. And, that's pointing, so there's a few things. So if there's an issue where the society, the structures of being inhibit the energy or the time energy or et cetera, so forth, needed in order to change the structure, then that would seem to be doom, unless the subject is able of creating energy on their own in mysterious, negantropic ways, right? And Cleo has talked about this, Luke has talked about this, we have all talked about this. It does, you're having a conversation, you're tired, and energy comes out of nowhere, it goes on for hours, you get drive. It does seem as if the human being, you take a cold shower, it does seem to be the case that the human being is able, under certain conditions, to mysteriously create energy, right? And if the system is not going to give you energy, and you need energy to change the system, this seems to be very important. And it would seem to be one of the mistakes of nudging is that it is a zero-sum game that is moving around the finite amount of energy available to get certain results, as opposed to a non-zero energy creation that is actually somehow environmentally affording more energy than would otherwise be given. And I would actually argue this is part of the creating wealth, the great enrichment of Bukowski, and what we actually see in history. And one of the keys that I think needs to be made in these books talking about the need to return institutions for economic well-being is that there are institutions that use up energy, and there are institutions that create the kinds of subjects who can generate their own energy, right? Which I would also associate with a movement from desire to drive or to intrinsic motivation. Where does the energy of the intrinsically motivated come from? It seems pretty freaking mysterious. And yet, if there's something about lack that is ontological, it seems to emerge. And I do very much enjoy how today we are talking about how to have successful New Year's resolutions. Fan-freaking-tastic. So this is very good. And I think it's also so there seems to be a very big difference between nudging people to a good result. Because, with that kind of theory, with Strassen or whatever, the book with the elephant on it, is that you're like, well, we're not authoritarians. We're not holding guns up and making people. So it's more moral than that. But it's really still authoritarian because you're trying to get a result. And you're basically yeah, holding guns up doesn't work as well. So the movement to nudging is almost just a pragmatic adjustment. It's not really a moral revelation. It's more like we want people to do stuff, but when we force them to do it, they don't like it. So how do we do it indirectly? Well, it's ethically not that different. You're just looking for a more effective means to do it, right? And it is you'll see in many, and I do think this all has implications for families and friends, because many relationships are destroyed because of nudging. But people are like, well, I'm not telling you what to do. No, you're just being passive aggressive. No, you're just suggesting everything I do is a failure. I almost rather you just straight up tell me what you want me to do as opposed to continually nudging, right? And so and Echomancer, and Jockin has pointed this out as well, is nudging is almost worse than authoritarianism in some respects because nudging kills social trust. Up is down, down is up. People don't mean what they're saying. It's all indirect, passive aggressive, and it devours energy. Absolutely devours energy, right? Nudging and nagging and all of that different stuff. It's like a Pac-Man. It just kills it all. Whereas with authoritarianism, it's yes, it's not using so much mental energy because good, bad, I know where you stand. Great. So in this way, nudging is worse. But then if you don't have the Krafel method, as I'm just tentatively calling it here, whatever that is, with the environment, it would seem as if the only alternative is authoritarianism. And it would just seem that everyone is basically trapped between authoritarianism or nudging or nothing, doing nothing at all, right? Well, nothing is perhaps better than either of those two, you could strongly argue, but if you have a systematic issue, capital, training people into the inability to think outside the logic of capital, then this all seems very, very problematic. But it does, I think, certainly the problem between authoritarian and nudging puts one on the side of the letting, as Wynne stresses, right? Okay, well, what is the kind of, what is a active letting? What is not a passive letting, right? Well, you were just mentioning there, Michelle, and I have many more notes, but before I talk forever, I'll throw it to Dimitri, is that there's something about when you commit absolute choice commit, I want to say, then this can kind of create energy, right? What does it mean to create environments that help the people around you commit to the unknown? And I think the unknown here is also different from nudging, because nudging has a quantitative outcome. You know what you want, right? You know what you want, and you know when you see it. But there seems to be a difference when you create an environment that actually make people courageous to commit to the unknown. Because you also have a problem here is, wait a minute, aren't we saying that we know what the good is? Isn't that a problem? The moment you're like, you need to do Krafel stuff, isn't there a certain sort of like outcome that's created? And I think I just froze. No, I'm not. Okay, great. So the problem is, you could say, well, aren't we saying that there's like an outcome that you have in mind and you know the good, and isn't that very problematic? Is that really, if that's the case, is the Krafel versus the nudge different? Well, the issue is that it would seem in the Krafel, like, oh, what you're talking about, there's a certain commitment. You don't know the outcome. You just know you need to do it, right? You have this sort of tug that you need to do it. So that's different from nudging. And if one is creating environments that incubate and create in people the kind of subjectivity to have that sort of courage and to do those things, that seems different from nudging because it is unknown and it's genuinely scary. But I do think that basically it is doing those kind of things that is necessary for you to taste the romance of reality that Sam is talking about. If you are unwilling to face your fears, then no, reality is not romantic. Your very fear of reality sucking then makes it suck. Your very fear of doors shutting in your face is what makes all the doors locked. Like, you have to have these commitments to do these things that you're afraid in order to have the beauty come forth on the other side, right? So there's that sort of challenge element that's part of it. And it seems to create energy. And in creating energy, you're able to move in a more non-zero-sum direction versus a zero-sum direction. But the temptation is not to do it. But yes, this energy point, it makes me think of Luke on Gurdjieff. There's this mysterious way of creating energy that people seem to have, and it is tied to courage and different things. I do have more note, but I'll pause and throw it to Dimitri. Dimitri, thank you for coming today, sir.
Yeah, good to be here. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
Yes. Yeah, this is an interesting conversation. I wasn't here from the start, so yeah, but I like, Sam, that you shared your thoughts on what the best books were that you read, and I think for me the three books that really stuck out were Zizek's Metastasis of Enjoyment, which is there's 6 essays on women and causality, and then Alenka Supancic, The Odd One In, and Lando Lars, A Voice and Nothing More. And yeah, I'm another thing I've been doing since October is this year is learning Chinese, and actually I think Bergson has some good thoughts on comedy specifically, but also on the opposition between life and mechanism, which is for him a kind of fundamental opposition. And so one of the things that I'm doing right now with Chinese is I'm learning 1,000 Chinese sentences, which means that I can, when I hear the English, I can say it in Chinese, and when I hear the Chinese, I can understand it. And so every day I start my day doing flashcards and reading the English sentence and then saying the Chinese back and just pronouncing this. And because I've been doing this for a while now, it starts becoming a bit more natural, but it's super mechanical to do this. And well, just like when foreigners learn English, they might look like robots, when it's also like, I'll probably sound like a robot. I probably sound like a robot when I speak Chinese. But a nice point that Bergson is drawing out between this opposition of life and mechanism is that actually that's where we see the truth of what language is. It is always this mechanical thing, but once we're in our native language, it just looks more lively because of this phantasmatic screen that we put on it. So actually it is when we dive into the alien and into like the foreignness of another language that we can see what the actual truth of it is, which is And I mean, you can also see this, for example, in comedy, that the role of imitation is very important. And what is imitated there is not live, but it's just mechanical things like gesticulation, maybe a weird little voice, right? And these are all mechanical things in the yeah, just the blunt sense of the word. But still, in this production of mechanism in imitation, something more is produced, and that's what makes it lively and imbues it with a type of spirit. And now another thing that's interesting about this opposition that Bergson draws out is that in relationship to like there's different orders in the sense that the body might seem mechanical if you relate it to transcendence or the soul or God or things like that. But then again, the body might seem lively in relationship to the clothes it's wearing. So, and so, yeah, and I mean, there's a whole, in the odd one in Alenka's punch, it really goes deep into what the nature of this opposition is. And one of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of this, yeah, like the mechanism of causality and like if I would say like efficient causality, especially. So, you know, the causal chain, basically cause and it goes to effect. There's like the question would be, okay, but what is that initial cause that sets up that brings the causal chain about? Of course, Aristotle had this answer to it. And now Zizek's dialectical materialism's answer to that is that there is no capital C cause, which is inspired by Kant and Hegel, of course, but basically that in the gap between cause and effect, that's really where we find, well, we find fantasy, and fantasy is kind of unavoidable top-down structure. So of course, reality is in a way bottom-up in the sense that there's many power relations, there's many contingent things happening all the time. We can never get an all-encompassing view, and that's where fantasy comes in, because this, let's say, the non-totalizability of reality, this is actually another name of the symbolic deadlock that we find ourselves in, which then has to be supplemented by fantasy. And so this is actually where you can see the how Kant thought of the subject as free. So for Kant, the subject had a noumenal freedom that was irreducible to its phenomenal reality, but that's not because he said, oh, there is something just like a divine miracle that has mandated this in some sense, but it's actually in the very failure of causality and this causal chain, again, the symbolic deadlock, the non-totalizability, that fantasy comes in for us to basically take up the desire of the other. And yeah, well, this has interesting ramifications also to if we think about things like we were mentioning energy in this conversation and self-motivation and these type of things. And more and more I am skeptical of creativity and also the particular uniqueness of not only myself, but like basically everyone who sees themselves as a creative, and because there is something very mischievous and not innocent at all about the notion that we have some type of latent creativity that we just have to bring out. And I don't think, in other words, I don't think creativity, I don't think self-motivation to precede their actualization. I don't think it's a latent thing that then we bring out. I think it's situated in the symbolic deadlock, and it springs forth from this symbolic deadlock, which I would say is the primacy of the primacy of the other, the primacy of the other, and I mean that's like if we read the things that are like the greatest works of art, it's really not the unique particularity of the person. Okay, it might also be that, but the primacy of it is like what type of social context were they situated in that allowed them to bring that forth, not because they already had it, but because of being situated in that social context. And yeah, you know, it's winter right now, and I'm a type of person like I live alone. I don't have roommates, and I really like being alone. And I also like being alone to the extent that I'll feel lonely, but I will not realize that I'm feeling that. So I'll just be like, oh, I don't know, I'm kind of depressed. I guess it's just me, or it's just what that I'm feeling that. And then it will take me some time to realize, wait a second, I didn't talk to a human in quite a while. That's kind of, and then I of course have a resistance, like, okay, I should then talk to someone. Oh God, but uh, so the point I'm making here is that like I do feel that I'll end up in this kind of symbolic deadlock and like I don't know, kind of like stuck in my own solipsism, and that you know that's really where fantasy flares up. And I would say like especially especially the following fantasy. So uh you know there's again there's a singularity to reality, not only in terms of fantasy, but also on what this fantasy is like supposed to resolve, or is basically uh, where it comes from, which is symbolic castration, which is another name for that symbolic deadlock. And for Lacan and Deleuze agreed in a very specific way in terms of metaphysics, which is that there is a difference, capital D, that precedes all differences. Of course, Hegel also agreed with this in his own way. There is not a oneness that then splits into two, but there's an inherent gap from the very beginning, which sets off its resolution, so to say, and the process of it in the dialectics. But the difference between Deleuze and Lacan in terms of this difference that precedes all differences is that for Deleuze it stays abstract and metaphysical in this sense, whereas for Lacan this difference that precedes all differences is symbolic castration. And so why castration? Like, isn't that maybe off-putting? But it's actually very important that psychoanalysis stays with that term and not just abstract lack. Why? Because there is a certain type of signifier for castration, and this is called the phallus. This is called the phallus. And the phallus as a signifier of castration actually brings together meaning and sexuality, or it brings together the body and the symbolic order, which is not a simple thing. Well, it's a simple thing at all in that fantasy just makes it turns it into a simple thing, but it's a very asymmetrical thing. It's a thing that we can never resolve. We can never get out of this symbolic deadlock. Nonetheless, there's this persistence of the phallus. And okay, so in metastasis of enjoyment, Zizek goes into courtly love, and that courtly love today is actually very popular, even though we might not think it. And now this book was written in the early 90s, but I think a perfect model of courtly love today is OnlyFans. Because what does OnlyFans do? It turns woman into this type of inhuman other with whom I can never get a relationship. I can just do obsessive little rituals, maybe like, you know, give $5, try to get a message, and oh, you look so beautiful. And then she's like, oh, thanks. And then I'm like, oh my God, you know, there's like a sliver of recognition or whatever. But these type of like obsessional rituals that always keep women at a distance, turn her into this inhuman other with whom no relationship is possible. And this is why it's so worrying, because this type of masochism that we find in, let's say, today's courtly love with OnlyFans or porn, or even dating apps, because they're very unsuccessful. And like, I mean, a lot of dating apps are just meant for you to keep using it, of course. But this is really where you can see that there's a symbolic deadlock, and then there's the kind of response to it by, okay, then I'll like turn myself into a masochist, turn the woman in like capital W into this inhuman other, which is like a total fantasy. And then this is really how psychoanalysis thinks about causality. So causality is always already sexualized in a way. We always find ourselves in a sexed reality, and that's why psychoanalysis is very skeptical, and not at least of asexual theories, because the question is, why is a certain person comporting themselves with this asexual theory, and what does that asexual theory have to do with his body? That's how I would ground it. So it's the position from which we speak is never innocent in that way. It always comes and also works to supplement a symbolic deadlock.
No, magnificent. And I'll throw it to Clayton here. Well, there's a few things. So first off, there's always classically, as we've talked about with Dante, this idea that the universe is moved by eros, right? Like you have to think already sexualized, and if you don't, you're in trouble, right? And there's absolutely a way to keep design, like what you were saying also about keeping at a distance to keep alive, and that this becomes kind of the space of freedom, of fantasy, and that nevertheless can be used in a manner where actually we end up mapping desire, keeping desire alive by this certain sort of inhumanization, like the relation to the other, right? So there's a few things with that, because this is always the problem of the social. And actually, I would argue the issue is that the debate, I keep saying that this kind of debate of what liberalism was and going to be was tied to this problem strongly. And when people didn't know how to deal with it, especially when it was pluralized, then you start moving with the problem of desire in terms of capital markets and capital flow, and ultimately a certain commoditization and fungibility of human beings that is supposed to keep desire alive by keeping away an object of desire that isn't kept so far away, though, that you can't relate to it. You can do various rituals to it and yet never get it. Because that's the fine balance. If you have an object that is too far away that you can't interact with it, it no longer cultivates desire and it becomes foreign to you. But if it's too close, then it actually loses that ability to keep you going, right? So you have to, so the internet is perfect, right? Because the internet is like, hey, I have an image of you, I have a scene of you, but you're never actually there, right? And I would actually argue what you're saying with OnlyFans, et cetera, so forth, is actually the logic of the global hikimorism that we've talked about before. The people never leaving their apartment, that actually that way of dealing with the symbolic is spreading into many, many different areas in many different ways. And the question is, well, it actually makes me think too what Michelle was saying, because there's a massive contradiction here that has to be dealt with. In a very real sense, I think the goal is to create, there's something about the Krafel method that is about creating environments where people, dare I say, have a certain level of self-sufficiency, a certain level of drive, a certain ability to not, you as the parent want to set up your kids to not need you. Well, that's weird. Cadell talks about the child killing, the father sets up the child to kill the father. That's weird, but there is a sense in that's what you're doing, right? You're actually creating environment in the same way you want to create environments for your friends to where in a way they don't need you, right? That they actually have a certain, because if they need you, there's a parasocial, parasite, that was struggling, I don't know why that was, but there's a problematic relation if there's too much need, right? But if there's no need at all, that also seems problematic. So what are we doing? What are we talking about, right? Because also too, if you successfully raise your children to say, be able to have self-drive, then that means success is also tied to not needing you. And yet what's weird is it's only in this condition that the conditions of possibility are for a beautiful social, for friendship, right? Like friendship in the kind of Aristotelian sense, which is between people who don't need one another and yet are bound by a certain beauty between one another. Like there's a weird way in which beauty, in this way that we'll talk about it, is you can't have too much of a need relationship, right? There has to be a mutual attraction, a mutual orbiting, which is for Dante erotic. It's like the social without the beautiful cannot deal with the problem of desire. in a Dante sense. Like you have to have, and the beautiful is not merely the symmetrical, but a certain depth and mystery of interaction that opens up between people. If you don't do that, then you end up, your best strategy is going to be some hickimoryism, right? That's actually going to be the logic. And so the problem is by liberalism today, you could argue not regaining what I think Kirk is putting forth, then actually it's going in its best possible direction, which is more hickimory, OnlyFans, et cetera. So, because how else do you deal with the problem of desire, right? So Krafel basically, you know, if we're taking this difference between Krafel and nudge theory, there's a way in which there are small changes in the environment that actually create environments where people become the kind of subjects where they are able to be self-sustaining, you can say, but then choose, here's the key move, choose not to be individualistic. In their self-sustaining, choose to be communal. Why? Why would you do that? Like, because you don't need other people. This is, I guess, the contradiction that is destroying our political system. Because, like, what liberalism became individualism because it didn't know how to deal with the because you also said something, you said a lot of things that are very important. So there's something also problematic about the idea of the individual being a creative genius, right? Like you have a certain latent creativity and it's all inside of you, right? I would argue that what you see in the many great artists is it's actually in sort of community and sort of social. It is in a people that brings out creativity. Like if you try to be an original artist without, say, reading the great books or reading literature because it will tamper your creativity or whatever, it's really bad, right? And I think that's the sort of philosophy you get when you have this idea that we all have an innate creativity that brings out, well, it depends on what you mean by that. Sure, there is creative potential in every individual, but only to the degree that you submerge yourself in otherness, put yourself in the place of encountering otherness, right? So it's a relation, there's a latent potential, but it is on the other side of the other side of dealing with other people, right? Like, and that's where people like Flannery O'Connor or Faulkner, all, you know, those people I really like, are like, you have to like really be embedded in this is the issue. Particularity is not on terms of the individual, it's particularity on the social, in the community. And this also gets into what you were saying on Kant, and I'm sorry, I'll throw it to Clayton in my, like, because a lot of what you were saying with Kant, I also just think about the model problem that George Box, that might be another way to language this similar thing. So George Box made a very important point. He said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So what he's getting at is the reason a model is useful is because it's not the same thing that you're modeling. Let's put it this way, the map territory way, right? A map is only useful because it's wrong, because it's not the territory, right? But if it's too wrong, then it doesn't work as a map. It's no longer useful. So it has to find a mean, if you will, between being wrong and useful, right? If it's too correct, it's useless because it's too complex. But if it's too wrong, it's also useless, right? In a way, freedom comes in the decision of the mean. The freedom emerges in the decision of the relation between the symbolic and the individual, right? And you have to choose it. Here's the point. The particular that we're interested in is that unlocks, that quote unquote, the creativity is afforded, is the particularity that is the mean between use and correct, between map and territory, where it's not too wrong that it's useless, but not too right that it's complex. That is what we want the mean for. And it is in that particular, you could almost say ratio, that unlocks possibility. And actually, similarly, it is in the social, between the right relation between yourself as an individual and the other, that unlocks things. But what is the right amount? You can't know it ahead of time. Otherwise, it's a formula. It has to be live figured in the surprising encounter. That means you're going to make mistakes. You're not going to know what to do. And that's where all the freedom is. All the freedom is in that screw up. And all the beauty is in that screw up. And that's the only place that you can deal with the problem of desire. Or else desire kills us all, or we flatten it with the logic of capital to get rid of it, or to direct the flows away from destroying one another, which ultimately leads with the logic of hickimoryism, because we don't know how to handle global pluralism. And so that is the kind of particularity that if we can't realize or think, then we end up in trouble, and we're not free. And then the question becomes, what are the small, like, I also was thinking about jokes. Like, there's something about a joke that's interesting because it does make me think of the Krafel method here. Because a joke is a small, often great revolutions in thought start in comedy, Like like the comedian's able to say something before everyone else. It's almost as if the comedian can introduce into language a small shift, just like Krafel is saying, a change on the hill that through time actually changes the entire environment in a much more right way. Likewise, a joke can introduce a little bit of thinking in the environment, change it a little bit of non-rationality that in the long way below makes very large changes, right? And that's where things like free speech and the ability to tell jokes in comedy is actually really, really important. Because otherwise, if you don't have that freedom, and I think this does go to the liberalism that someone like Kirk is talking about, if you don't have that freedom, you're going to end up in either authoritarianism or nudge theory. And both of them are quantitatively the same. I have more notes on more things about what you were saying, Dimitri, but I'm going to stop and throw it to Clayton and then Michael. Clayton, good to have you, sir.
Yeah, Happy New Year. Interesting tangents. So something to add to that, like I agree with all of that, and it does seem to me like one of the conflations, I think Dimitri just touched on that, is that we're getting the way I'm hearing it is like we're getting sort of like trapped into the you'd say individualistic way of seeing things. Like we're trying to narrow things down to just a one, and forgetting to balance it with the many. And I think we've spoken about this. Like the thing that it reminds me is like yesterday I was trying to teach my daughter how to ride a bike without training wheels, and so it's an interesting challenge. But the thing that it brought back to me was that dilemma of like, what's the one thing you have to do when you ride a bike? And the framing of that question is is very tricky. It quickly traps you into thinking about what is the one thing. But actually, if you analyze riding a bike, it's not one thing. It's like, or maybe you gotta push off the ground while trying to push the pedal at the same time. So you gotta do those two things and hold the handlebars at the same time and keep your eyes where you're going, and then figure out the whole balancing thing as the bike wobbles, as it tries to get stability and move to where it needs to go while carrying you. And so it's a collection of things. Yes, we call it one name, riding a bike, but it's not one thing. It's many things happening all at the same time. And the moment any one of those things goes off, the riding of a bike fails. and then you have to go back and analyze and say, oh wait, what failed? I wasn't looking where I was going. Okay, I'll fix for that. Then you try again, and then I didn't put enough pressure on the pedal. Then you fix for that. Or I didn't correct the balance of the weight again. And so you have to keep fixing until you get all those things aligned, and then it will happen in synchrony as a one thing. And when that happens, we sort of we forget the many and how it came to be, and then we kind of think it as the one, and then we sort of like you'd say reduce it to just that one thing, and then we put a distance between us and it, and it's like it's because it's one now. Because now that we've sort of like collected the model into ourselves and we're embodying it, it's like, yes, it's just one thing. And it's always a challenge. Like even something as simple as tying shoelaces. I don't remember who asks this and says, I think it's Vaveki, says if you had to write down the steps of articulating the process of tying shoelaces, all of a sudden it's not it's not as simple as it looks, right? It's oh wait, I gotta hold the string this way and then do this and then do that and then do this and then, but I would just get shoes without laces, yeah, right? Exactly, yeah. But to go back to it, it's like it's a whole set of things that need to happen as a collective, and for me, what that means is that it's almost like we're always trying to build that relationship, the knowledge, like the knower trying to know the knowee. That's how I'm phrasing it. It's like you have to know something, and you have to know each other, and you hold a piece of it in you, and they also hold a certain knowledge that you need to gain, and then whatever relationship emerges, then when that relationship happens successfully, then you have knowledge. But then it's not like you have it, because like you're participating in knowledge, and if there is no knowledge, then the relationship sort of breaks, and then there is no knowing, because the knower doesn't really know. I guess that's where you get the whole understanding thing failing. You find yourself missing the standing, and you misunderstand, and then it falls on you, and it's like, oh, I thought I understood it, but I did not. And so anyways, all of that to say that I reckon like it's a pretty difficult task to balance how much you're being trapped in what in the particular, and yeah, it's hard, and because you have to maintain that relationship with the map, right? Like in my language, I would say you have to always keep a double relation. It's like you have to keep relating to the map, which is your source of right, and find the correct spot on the map. Otherwise, because the map is always right, the map cannot be wrong. The map cannot be wrong. Otherwise, then the map is pointless, right? So we have to find the correct spot. Otherwise, we can't correct ourselves if the map is wrong. We can only use it and correct ourselves if the map is right. And if the map is right and we find ourselves in the wrong spot, then we have the opportunity to correct. Otherwise, if we're in a map that is not right, then we can't even correct. So we just get sucked into it. Anyways, before I mix up too many of the metaphors, I'll hand it back.
No, that's fantastic. No, thank you very much. Well, so there's this weird thing, right? Like in this moment, when you say the map is wrong, how do you know the map is wrong if the map's not telling you? And yet you have a real apprehension that it's wrong, right? So so that's the non-rational moment. In the girdle point, the break of the map is the territory. It is not reducible to a rational calculus, and that's where freedom is possible, like Dimitri's pointing back. That moment when you go, the map is wrong, now you're free. Screw this. That's the weird thing, is the location of Hegel and Kant and psychoanalysis, where freedom is in that moment when it breaks, and you say, screw this. But when the map breaks, it could curve into new possibilities, like Sam is saying, if you have a romance of reality in that moment. The craft is in parentheses. It's also the love of Dante. It just depends on how you can experience it. There's also this weird thing where if the map is wrong, it's useless, but it is wrong because it's not the territory. So it's useless, right? No, it's not. So what's going on? What's going on? Because it's intelligible to you, because you're able to judge it. There's some sort of relation with it where you don't have a psychological breakdown. Right? And you could argue that a lot of the mental health problems is where people are finding the map is not the territory and they're having some sort of psychological breakdown, right? Et cetera, right? So there's this moment of apprehension, right? Also critically, a map failing is not the same as not having a map, like of no map. Okay? So this is where I say lack is not nothing. So where the place where the map fails is not the same as never having a map, right? So you need to have a map, but the weird thing is the point of the map, well, this is what I would argue is the only way we deal with the problem of internally consistent systems and maps and global pluralism, is today the point of the map precisely has to be for these failure points, actually, because that is what frees us from the map, but also can overwhelm us, right? So the point of maps today is their failure, because that is not the same as never having a map. And that also is what makes the difference between the map and the territory intelligible to us and meaningful. And that's a space of freedom. But freedom overwhelms us. But freedom is also where you can move beyond plastic bags. Freedom is also where you can have the beauty that Sam is talking about, right? So this is the real challenge. And also to this, the reason why this is all very, very relevant is because this kind of overlaps with, you could argue, the problem of liberalism as well. Because here's another way to look at liberalism that everyone is critiquing now, is the idea of you have the least of all possible laws, okay, or rules, and you have to have rules because that's where the universality comes back. Rather, atheist, Christian, whoever, if you know the rules, we all share the rules. So even if we have different moral judgments, we have something in common, right? So like laws and rules make the possibility of a constitution. Let's just say that, a constitution. And there was an obsession in liberalism with social contract theory and all of these different things, right? Because the idea we have a contract, therefore we have something in common. But here's the issue. The US Constitution does not cover every possible scenario that emerges in the United States of America between people, right? Nor does law cover every possible situation. In fact, the majority of it is what Haidt called custom, right? So here's the issue. I'll just keep it to the Constitution. The Constitution necessarily, in order to function, can't be perfect. It's like a map. It has to be wrong. That's why it can be useful. It doesn't cover everything. That's why it's useful. So the necessity of liberalism is that people would know what to do in those times when it wasn't covered by law and it wasn't covered by the Constitution. That's where freedom would be, when it was a kind of failure. Like when liberalism failed, that's when freedom would be, in a sense. Like the freedom of liberalism is when stuff arises that isn't covered by liberalism, right? But what if people use that freedom to just, I don't know, do a 2008 financial crisis, take advantage of other people, reduce their subjectivity to get rid of beauty? What then? Well, then liberalism fails. But it also fails in terms of the space of the failure that is part of its very operation. So does that mean you need to go to something that's getting rid of liberalism? Well, that could just be belonging again in a traditional way that proves a return to the banality of evil and all of those other stuff, right? So it's all going to come down to I'll stop and throw it to Michael, Seth, Thomas, and then Chris. It's all going to come down to our ability to handle the space where the map is not the territory, where it fails, where it breaks, out where the law fails, where the law does not apply. What do we do there? Well, that's going to, if it's not top down, in that sense, it's virtue, it's habit, it's skill, it's discernment, it's meta judgment, it's wit, it's the ability to think well in situations where there is not givenness. But then what is your standard of operation? Well, we've talked about lack and beauty all the time. And if you don't have to, and if you can't, then the problem of desire destroys you if you don't know how to deal with this. I will stop and throw it to Michael here. Michael.
Well, it makes me think of your often cited example of the doorknob from Heidegger. Like you only realize, you only pay attention to the doorknob when it's broken, right? You take it for granted when it's there. Just like when you know how to ride a bike, you just think you don't even think about it often until your chain snaps, or you get a flat tire, or you hit a pothole and you lose your balance, or you try and teach someone who doesn't know how to ride a bike, and you're all of a sudden like, wait, like it actually is this complex system that I'm not aware of. And I think oftentimes the crisis point for individuals spiritually and emotionally comes when the rote default way of doing things just kind of collapses. And it's something that happens to you, as opposed to necessarily always being, a map that you are consciously stress testing against the world. I think that is kind of like the second evolution, but it seems like for a lot of people, and this usually happens in like young adulthood, like the way you were raised, the kind of just water that you were swimming in, that you didn't really have a lot of agency to affect change in as a young person. Usually it kind of happens, once you exit that and go to college or something, and you're like, whoa, like the way I was living my life really didn't prepare me for all of this difference, right? Um, and so, yeah, it seems like often the kind of failure of maps happens um, when the environment strikes us, as opposed to, when you can think of like the creative person or the athlete kind of tinkering and trying and kind of like trial and error. But I think oftentimes maps fail without our volition, and it kind of like it's like that like surprise and that strike, which is at first more of a terror, I would say, than a beauty, because it kind of like shakes you awake, right? It shakes you out of like a certain slumber. Um, but at the same time, it can be beautiful in the sense of its transformative potential, to inspire new ways of being and perspectival knowing in the world. So that was one thing that I wanted to mention. The other thing, this was a little while back, but you were talking with Dimitri about the creative act and kind of the difference between, kind of thinking of creativity as something purely existing within the subjectivity of an individual and the interior of an individual that just has to be like, kind of released, exercised, and the difference between thinking of creativity in that way as opposed to kind of something that, it is maybe exists latently in the universe, the universe as inherently creative. And that's something that, we tap into, and tap into the great conversation, right, with the writers and the creatives of all ages. And it's something that I've been thinking about, because I'm reading this book by Mark Vernon, called Awake, the book that he wrote on William Blake that just came out. I'm doing a course over at the online community that I'm a part of called Versed on Blake, and we're actually having a Q&A with Mark Vernon at the end of the month. And he mentioned something that I thought was really interesting, that the etymology of subjective and objective actually used to be the inverse of what it is now. So like the word subjective used to refer to that which exists outside of us in the world. And then at some point it got flipped to talk about, what exists within our unique, individual experience. And then objective used to be what is kind of just qualitatively observable about the world. And now it's kind of like the kind of one defined, reality irrespective of observation. And I found that really interesting in thinking about, art, and kind of what he was talking about is like, Blake is just this fascinating case of this person who, like, you read biographies of him, and it's like at 7 or 8 years old, he's seeing like Mary in like, just like he's like walking in the woods and he's like, oh yeah, like I saw Mary today, or like I saw like the apostles, just like spiritually in the forest. And so it's like, it's such an example of an artist who I don't think he would describe himself as like, oh, I'm just expressing the interior of my, emotionality or something. Like, it's like he's having the cosmic visions that are transmitting themselves, like communicating into him, and he's merely the kind of conduit for that. And I think that to me is a more inspiring, and also, like, I think it alleviates the burden that a lot of people feel who want to be creative, who are like, well, I wasn't born into a creative family, or, when I go down to write, it's just my mind's blank. Or, I haven't learned the tools and the techniques of the craft. Like I don't, I don't know where to start. And it's all focused on like, kind of the diminishment of the self, as opposed to, the kind of emphasis on connecting with something outside of yourself. And Daniel, you talk about like you just find yourself writing. You don't sit down with the intention to write something in particular. You go on a walk, and then the idea for a story just comes to you, and it has to just then flow. It's like, well, what are you doing in that in that experience? It's like you are opening yourself up to something entering in, it seems like. So yeah, it's interesting to think about all of those things, and kind of how kind of like putting in intentional awareness on, even something like doing the dishes, like something rote and mundane. Like I hear artists talk about all the time, like some of their best ideas for poems come from just doing the dishes, right? And I think it's like, it's that idea you talk about too of renewal, right? Like seeing something you've done a million times for the first time, as opposed to constantly seeking out newness. I think that's also seems like a trap that a lot of creative people that I observe get into, where it's like, I just got to constantly be listening to new music so that I can get inspired, so that I have, all these different colors in my palette that I can play with. And that in some respects, I think that's true. Like read widely, right? You have then just so much more material to draw on. But I think also I just got inspired by Michelle talking about decluttering, that I like just started organizing books that I want to donate. And I was looking at like books in my shelf, and I was like, oh, there's all these books that I've read and I could donate, and, I could make space for all the new books that I've gotten. But I'm like, what if this new year I decide to just pick up a book that I read 2 years ago and see how it strikes me again, as opposed to just buying new books, all the time. So that might be an interesting thing to play with. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
Do that. Jack Bald, a good friend of mine, once said that there are certain books. It's a very good practice to take a book and read it again every 10 years. Maybe Augustine's I did that with Like I've read Confessions many times with Mr. Abel. And actually it is completely insane how much they change and come alive to you. And to me, that puts into practice the return of human Hegel, where when you return, or Deleuze says, the key to repetition is you find out there's no such thing. There's always an excess. There's always something new that comes up. I really do think the experience of that wild magic of reading a book again and feeling like you're reading it for the first time, that is more of the experience that starts, I think, training you for the creative. Actually, I think there is virtue in listening to new things. I think you don't want to reject whatever diversity your environment or world throws at you. It does become problematic when you begin choosing, I'm going to listen to jazz, then salsa, then country, or whatever, because the ego is driving it. And that's not inherently bad, but that could just be a Hegelian spurious infinity, as opposed to when the radio pops on a country song, you don't say, I don't like country. Just let it wash over you. Actually, I find that you want the diversity to be surprising versus chosen, and that is different. And I know I'm getting into different things. Also, to what you were, and I'll close and throw it to Seth and Thomas and Christian here. What you're also getting at, I just want to note, is notice with Blake that there's almost it seems individualistic, but also there's a heavenly host working through. There's a social, right? The trick with the artists is they're bringing the social alone into themselves, right? So it seems alone, but then it also is not alone, because there's something more going through. And the artist does have to spend a lot of lonely times, in the bedroom working on their craft, right? But But what they are honoring in that setting is something more, is something that has a communal edge, right? Where they're not actually separating to avoid, there's almost like a purity doctrine with creatives. They don't want to be tainted. They want to stay pure, right? That's very problematic because such purity actually leads to blandness. The thing I was going to say very quickly, here's the issue again. I keep bringing up this liberalism debate because I do think it's very important. Someone like Russell Kirk is going to say, liberalism emphasizes the individual as, dare I say, a conduit of creativity and social imagination. The individual is the point by which the individuals are portals. Let me use that language. Individuals are portals. You're emphasizing the individual because the individual is where the portal happens. But the portal is always dividual in that Deleuzian sense. It's always a multiplicity, right? What ended up happening is the individual in liberalism, instead of thinking of the individual as a portal, it became the individual as the rugged individual, as making your own way, right? So making a name for yourself. So then the emphasis on individual went in the direction of you as an individual rising to the top of a hierarchy, okay? Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad. You know, there's a real problem when you demonize competition in all forms, right? But there is a very big difference between a defense of the individual as the portal of spirit, you could even say, the portal of this creative unfolding, this portal of possibility, versus the defending of the individual because don't step on me, get off my back, government, I'll take care of myself, right? Those are very different models. And that needs to be defined, I think, in the political discussion. I'm going to stop and throw it to Seth here, Thomas, and then Christian. Seth, please. And I think of you when I read Krafel, because I'm like, small movement of the foot, big difference. Like, there's something about your method in Krafel that come to mind, Seth. Anyway.
One of my New Year's things is basically reorganizing my business, meaning that it's still going to be the same business. So there will be a continuity, but there's a lot of practical changes, you know, that I think will help it, let's say, run smoother, make it clearer to people what it is that I offer, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, a lot of what we're talking about here, I'm not really thinking practically about my business as I listen, but it's my predicament is like what we're talking about, right? And I was really struck earlier on by when Sam was talking about the plastic, and you know that it's a product of us, and how it's really the problem of the plastic is the problem of who we are. And I also wrote down what Michelle was saying, that how we can create change from the inside, and how this might actually create a demand, or it might sort of produce a demand for change in those around us, but that is different from nudging them. And just everything we're talking about here about you know, doing those things that we don't know how they're going to work out, and discovering where the map is not the territory, discovering where the map is wrong. I just find myself saying, like, all of this, and I feel like in this, you know, community here, there's a good understanding of this dynamic. I mean, it's been discussed many times in different ways, you know, like the value of improvisation, the willingness to not know, and all the rest of that. But before we step into the improvisation, there really is a necessity of courage. And even slightly different than that, I would say there has to be a trust. So like a trust that this could work out, right? So it's very interesting, because I can get myself into a place where if I don't go into the social space, I can control everything, you know, and therefore I do know the outcome. And yet a lot of what I'm capable of is never unlocked, because I'm not put into that improvisatory place, which might be terrifying for me. But But it's like what I'll notice often is that I could be working with a client and essentially responding to my client. I don't know what they're going to bring up today, but we've done this before. There's a certain context that's familiar, even though this familiar context is going to bring up the mystery, and then I'm just going to respond, and I'm going to respond ahead of time, and I can feel really really good in that place and say, okay, like I have this capacity, I could do this again. And then when I'm not in the interaction, when I'm actually sitting at home imagining the interaction, that's the place where actually sometimes it's harder to trust. It's harder to have the confidence, right? Like if you, as they say, jump into the water, like, okay, now you're already swimming, right? Because you have to. But there's this way that, when we go back to that place of apparent safety, that can be the place where we get stuck, right? Like okay, I did all these difficult things today, and now I'm done with that, and like, wait, I have to get up and do it again tomorrow. Anyways, I've been very interested in what was brought up on the net last week about how memory could be related to eternity rather than just the past, which I find really interesting. Well, also, I mean, I can take it back to this example of, I'm trying to reformulate my business. I can look at the current state of my business and sort of say, well, that's how it is. But of course, it's the accumulation of my past decisions. But then for me to imagine, well, I'm going to run things totally differently. It's going to be, like a brand new business. Then, there's the problem of, well, I can't do that overnight. It's going to have to be incremental. Well, if I'm kind of dealing with the present situation as unfolding within eternity, then the things that are maybe not to my liking right now, which are the result of the past, they don't feel as heavy. They just sort of represent, maybe even clarify for me that what we build is a gradual thing, and it really takes me back to that question of like, what kind of person have I been since I started my business? Oh, that's what created the current reality. And then to think of the future is to make a plan, and I'm going to tinker with this and tinker with that, and reorganize how I do this aspect of something. But it's also to really imagine that I am going to be a different person. And and it's actually hard. I guess what I want to put these together is it's often harder for me to imagine myself becoming a different person when I'm alone, when I'm not interacting with someone new. But when I'm, in a conversation like this one, where I don't necessarily know what I'm going to say, or I don't know what others are going to say, I already feel like a different person, because of, wait, what am I doing here? This is unfamiliar. And so there's something about, there was something else, I think, oh yes, this is another, just for my notes, Daniel said, how do we create the environment that invites others to courageously face the unknown? And another thing I just want to bring in is that a big question for me, it's a long-term question, but it's sort of come to a finer point for me than it ever has before, is relationship to, I'll just say, God, right? But I definitely had a whole period of my life where it was like the map clearly showed, right, that there is no God, all religion is bunk, etc., etc. So I've come a long way with that, but at least because of my past, right, and the way it's accumulated up till now, it still seems very strange for me to imagine becoming part of a particular religious community, which has a certain problem with it, because I do believe that if I was among others, right? Who believe in God and have enough of a shared vocabulary that I could work with, that would allow me to have an experience that would be much richer than me sort of sitting at home wondering about this. At the same time, I think that my sort of personal history as an atheist makes me very like I've imagined, well, let's say I become a Christian. Well, actually, I don't like the idea of wholeheartedly rejecting my atheist past, or I don't like the idea of saying, well, that was wrong and now I've found the thing that is right, because, you know, through conversations like we have here and my own just experience, you know, I'm very interested in this question, like the way John Vervaeke frames it as the meaning crisis, or you know, Nietzsche saying God is dead. And you know, if we step away from the particular traditions, I still think that there's something about a belief in God, or something about the idea that I, that you, that he and her, that everyone was created, you know, in a kind of perfection that would tie to this idea that, oh, maybe it is a good idea to leave the house and not be a hikikomori and go out there and interact with people I've never met before and I don't know what they're, because actually we were all, you know, created by God. We're all some kind of perfection that is just waiting to spark in new ways. There's beauty that's just inherently ready to bloom into the world. So, you know, so it continuously for me, I've mentioned before, I've been working with A Course in Miracles, which I think is a really beautiful offering, because on the one hand, it you know, it uses, I'm sure that many Christians don't appreciate that the narrator is Jesus and it's not the Jesus from the New Testament of the Bible. But at the same time, it uses a familiar language of Christianity, but then it gives you these proposals, it gives you these practices, it gives you these ways of meditating or playing with perception or observing your thinking. And the basic proposal, as I understand it, is just always to sort of assume that you are, in fact, connected to something divine, that there is something that will innately come through you and be, in a certain manner of saying it, perfect, that you actually do not have to strive. You do not have to, you know, worry or compare yourself, blah, 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 blah. It can start to sound like a lot of what the self-help texts would say as well. But there's a kind of, at least coming from an atheist background, to believe in God is to believe in something that is completely infallible, right? And apart from some sort of thing about like, can I prove it or not? If there's something infallible, then the type of confidence I can have is completely transformed. And even this sense of like, it also came up on the previous net in relation to memory and spirits and eternity, the question of grief, right? So I could fall in love and I could be with this person and then I could lose them, and it could just feel like, you know, pain every time that I'm reminded of the person that I lost. Or if viewed from eternity, this kind of like, this moment that, yes, it might be painful, it could illuminate the beauty of that love, right? In this cosmic way. And I think I understood, I haven't read Dante, but I think I understood in the conversation that this sort of painful beauty was related to this idea that you can only take so much beauty. And it's funny because I actually, at the end of college, I dated this woman who was a redhead and her favorite color was orange. And I was crazy in love with her, right? And then it ended. And I have to tell you, it was so unbelievably painful. It was like, why does the sun have to keep coming up? Why does the sun have to keep going down? And yet it was like one of the most thrillingly beautiful things I ever experienced in my life. Like, it kind of, you know, I was deeply sad. I was this young guy who's like depressed, you know, because I'm kind of a hopeless romantic. But there was something in that it was like, wow, if I could tap into that. so I associate that too with what I'm trying to understand right now about something like the divine. It's like, well, it still can suck. It can still be painful. But if you can be deeply, if you can experience deep discomfort, but it doesn't destroy you, it kind of, somehow there's some renewal in it as well. Yeah. Anyway, I'm just listening to this conversation and thinking about, again, because we've spoken about these questions before, I feel like in this particular Zoom room, there's a certain amount of faith that's already here, right? In the value of improvisation, in the value of going into the girdle point. But how do we get that? And yeah, I'm running out of things, but it's just, I think what I notice when I'm here is that it can sound like abstract. It can sound like a lot of references to, books that a lot of people maybe haven't read or whatnot. But there's something about even the fact that everyone would sit here and have this conversation, which connects to the part of me that maybe feels lost or confused at different points. But then, it's like, I come here, and so there's something divine in that spark that's between us that I'm struggling to articulate. So I'll stop here.
No, magnificent. Well, so first, that entire tension you were describing with this beauty that will destroy you love, for me, the quote unquote romance of reality is tied to participation in that tension. Like if you describe the romance of reality without live participation in that tension, which is dangerous, then you're not actually going to experience the romance of reality. It will be words. It will not be beautiful. The beautiful must be dangerous, or it is not itself, right? And one could argue that basically when Lacan and different people are talking about objects of desire and, that gets integrated into capitalism, there's a way in which there's a weird way in which we think capitalism is all about desire, but in another way, it's about not desiring. It's about mediocre desire. It doesn't want you to desire that way. It doesn't actually want passion. It may say it wants quote unquote passion, but it uses passion as a simile for like, not for suffering on the cross per se, or this desire that can bring about suffering, right? So there's a way in which, C.S. Lewis said our problem is that we're too easily pleased, right? But there's an issue where if you don't know how to handle beauty, then maybe it's better to be too easily pleased. If there are no elders, no churches, no community, no friendship that can train you to handle the spaces in which desire could reach its fullness, because that requires improvisation, that requires wit, that requires skill, then maybe we're better off too easily pleased, right? And you could basically argue that is the direction that we have gone in. We've just figured that, it's almost explicit in Fukuyama's End of History. It's like, it's better to go with the last man than strive for the thematic and the sort of greatness that can get us all killed, right? Because it's too much, right? Because it is only the highest angel that becomes Lucifer, right? But the issue is that humans cannot actually, we require this space, actually. We do eat ourselves all the same. We just do it in a different way. If we don't face this, we just die by the self-effacement of Hikimorism. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. But the end is all the same, as Eliot might put it. I will say also very quickly, when you make the shift, for example, of saying memory is spirit, we can look at that as a Krafel, as we've been saying with this book, this Krafel change, because it's a small shift in how you view memory. There's no nudging. There's a small change in how the water flows on the hill that changes your entire life, right? Like it changes how you think about everything. You believe in God, that changes everything. And for me, that example you gave precisely shows the true is not the rational, and that you require the non-rational. Because belief in God or not belief in God, you could see rational accounts for either, right? But you choose one and it changes the entire directionality of rationality, right? Like it changes what is logical. It changes how you would act, right? Likewise, to choose to see memory as spirit, which would be a non-rational move, would change the rational way to approach your past. The rational way to think about your future. It'd have a massive implication, right? You could argue that's a movement of mental architecture, design, like Sam was mentioning, but it changes everything. That is getting at what Krafel is talking about with the environment to play on. That basically, in my opinion, that move is what liberalism lost as a possibility and therefore became nudge theory based on the good and ended up in the Fukuyama direction, to go back to what we were saying at the beginning in the last few sessions, right? But in order to make that kind of mental move, you have to be the kind of subject that can do it. And the question becomes, how do you get people to do it if you're in different spaces? And that's what we're kind of talking about. What does it look like to create environments that spread the conditions of possibility of people to be willing to enter into spaces where they can make those kind of moves, right? What does that do? Because in a way, the environments of which help people make commitments to the unknown were churches, right? The unknown just had the word God. And actually, to the degree that these spaces became overly certain about God, that there was not space for surprise and encounter, they perhaps lost a bit of the training to make subjects do that, and therefore lost some of the spirit, right? But that's happened in Christianity. And I would tie that to the loss of lack and beauty and so on. I have more notes, but I will throw it here to Mr. Jockin and then Christian. And if anyone has final things to say this evening, Thomas Jockin, thank you for coming, sir. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here. Actually, I feel like I feel like I have to disclose it. Just maybe I don't. Maybe I do. Well, I have to because Seth's comments went right to the point. My father passed away yesterday, so now obviously maybe like, why am I here? He's been in critical condition for a very long time. He's been sick for a very long time, and we knew this was coming. I had 2 days with him. So it's not like I don't have the suffering of a complete ripping away, unexpected. This was a different kind of relationship, mostly because my mother and me were his caretaker for the last 26 years of his life. He had a stroke in 1999 that paralyzed him. So Seth's points kind of forces me to have to disclose this only because I need to talk about that, just because I'm living that experience right now of the presence of someone that you love very much being stripped away, that sorrow that you experience. It is a practice of spirituality at the highest level. It is, because you have to, the reorientation of the revelation of your entire life is revealed to you by this is very important, not only from the presence of that person as a partial object in the living sense of presence with you, but even when they go, the revelation of who this person was to you, the eternity of what the relationship is shown to you. Now, this, again, it looks poetic to say it that way, but it's true in the sense of you understand the relationship you have. And I think, very importantly, your nature. I spoke with Daniel earlier privately about this, but Daniel, and I brought this up to Daniel, I spoke with him, what he made last week about memory is the reward of virtue, is because we don't want to remember the regrets if you do not have that good relationship with your lost one. Because that comes back to you with a horrendous twisting. Thank God I do not have that. So while I have the mourning of sorrow losing my father, I do not have that. And I also say that because in the decline of my father, there was reconciliations occurring in the room as my father was passing away. So the encounter, that's why I'm bringing this up, the space for courage is even in those limit moments of death of the human person. It is possible. Not everyone enters that space. Not everyone's willing to do that, but it is possible. And of course, I say this because holding that space for that, for that resolution of the moment of the strike is right there in front of you, is in that moment of death. It's one of those moments. And actually, it's interesting because that's the thing. If you notice, everybody instantly, when the passing happens, there's this instant need of drive to commune. Everybody needs to pull each other together, and the material we use is memory. Because that's all you can. This is so important. That's why I say virtue. When we say virtue is memory is reward of virtue. It's not only because you're saved from the horrendous twisting of regrets of this could have been, I wish I did this. The time that we could have had together, I took away. That's the thing. It's the thing when it's a chosen stripping away, that you did something that you chose not to have that relationship with that person, and now it's gone forever. It's that issue because you chose it. That's the part that I see the twisting of the soul on that one. But when you have virtue, you have memory. Because if you do not have memory, how can you you can't, you have nothing to work with this time with each other you have with them. So again, I say all this because the last note is, I just find it interesting because like even just the person in your relationship in your life is a kind of knowledge, no? Because you get something revealed about what kind of person you are by your relation to them. Not even because what I know in the beginning was what Dimitri was saying and things like that. I had notes about that in the beginning. I made a comment. I was thinking about this. When is there ever the presence of knowledge without a person? There's always a presence of a human being. So knowledge does not just appear out of nowhere. It is always in the presence of something, rather a person or told by a story or encoded in some way symbolically, but there's always a person involved in some way, let alone even if in the very much raw experience of perception, there's a human person encountering it. So there's still always a person, even if it's a singular one. And I just find that kind of communion of the living desire and the revelation of what it means to be a human being held in memory of the eternity of someone that you love very deeply and to know that you love them very deeply. And I actually relationship of someone you love belovedly with you. I think there's also a kind of peace that occurred at the end, especially when I saw when this occurred this way, to have this kind of relationship. There's a kind of, and you don't, that's the thing, because you never could repair. That's the thing, I'm giving all this context because it wasn't like we were never aware my dad was going to pass away. We knew. And we had preparation. We know it was coming. He was put in hospice. We had everything ready to go. Yet, nevertheless, all the preparation, you find the revelation of the moment. You find out truly who you are in that moment. That's what I mean by knowledge with the person and the eternity of the encounter is revealed in that. And in the beauty, and then in that domain of the beautiful and the eternity, it can be at the safeguard of the human soul in those moments. Death does not have to destroy you, absolutely. I'm not sitting here saying I'm not absolutely annihilated. I think especially as a caretaker, apparently I found out later about this, there's a special kind of grief that occurs when you're a caretaker, mainly because there's this, I had a horrendous adrenaline sympathetic response last night, mostly because you think you have to go save them, but there's nothing to save, so the body doesn't know what to do. So the body doesn't even know, again, spiritual, a Muslim, know what this means religiously for him. He had a great, as best of a death as you possibly could ask for, no pain, very easy. So under all metrics, rationally, I can say this was as good as it could be under the circumstances. Yet nevertheless, this body screams at me, and it needs to be reoriented. Obviously this is very much the encounter of the real to kind of talk this language. But I think a lot of times we get this idea that I think it's very important. And I have to tell you that the relationship, I think it's very important that when people, the symbolic is very important. We need the symbolic because we need to orient this. This cannot be just allowed to just go in a complete excess. The human soul can't handle this. Not by now. But I will also comment, obviously, most of the people, we feel actually weak speech. We have no way to talk to each other beyond the symbolic mediation of, oh, it's in a better place. I can accept all those points. Yet nevertheless, this body's screaming at me, where's my father? You know what I mean? Like it's that double, you can acknowledge both. Both can be true at the same time. So I guess I'll just close in terms of, very much in this moment of like the revelation of the death and the pulling of this, you find out what matters to you, your principles and values get revealed to you immediately. In that moment. And this is the kinds of knowledge and truth that, in one sense, especially when you were in integrity with it, it's actually the godsend of all godsends. Because you get to have that peace in that relation with your father, in that loved one, and how you lived your life. And it's certainly kind of restitution and courage that I think is very important. I just want to share this. I hope this, I wanted to be, when you're mourning, you want to be with people, but it's very difficult to decide if you want to contribute or not. I didn't want to be selfish and to kind of share this, kind of dump this on everybody, but I felt like this was important just to add to the philosophy of this, because what's the point of this philosophy if we're not going to actually encounter death and mediate with this? Because there's so much, if people don't have these relationships and these phases to work through these encounters, then you're just lost to yourself. So I just want to contribute that for those reasons. So thank you for listening to me.
We're honored you'd share, Thomas Jockin. Thank you. And thank you for being here. Your spirit is what makes this place what it is. So thank you for being here, Thomas Jockin. We are in your debt. Everything you said, I think, is very, very important. Also, too, to be a caretaker, you are setting yourself up for having to experience that. And it would be easier just not to avoid it. And many people do. I think that's the temptation of the Hikimorism. And to not give into that temptation, I think, is very, very important. I think also, too, like what you're saying there, and I think it overlaps with what Seth was saying. I think one of the reasons why people can avoid one another and not invest in one another is because then you don't have the possibility of a moment occurring that reveals you to you, right? Like somebody, because you can see this as well, like when you have kids, you find out, oh, I'm not as patient as I thought, right? When you go and hang out with people that are very different from you, like, wow, I can't have a little voice in my head that's angry all the time. Oh, huh. Actually going, like there's a revelation of you to you in the presence of other people, right? And especially the moment of death has this crescendo to it because that's it. And you have to, and there's this retrospective seeing yourself in light of all of the choices you made in light of that person. And I think there's the temptation of saying, well, then I just won't have relationships, so I don't have to feel death in that way. I won't have that experience of memory that goes with death. And I think there's a temptation there. And I think the ease of giving into that temptation is higher if you don't have spaces with people by which you can work through things, philosophy, talk, like what we do, I think. And then if you have a society that doesn't necessarily even let you know where you can go to be trained for those moments, then it can be easier to give into the temptation to lock out. But I think it's very important not to, because also, like Seth was saying, when you go into places, there's this interesting, when you're with other people, you see yourself. Moments can occur where you see the truth of yourself, but that also is the opportunity to see that you can be different, that things can work out. There's a blessing in that moment, right? It goes both ways. And I think that's a lot of what we've been saying, is that heaven is hell if you're not ready for it. The moment where the map isn't the territory is the moment of freedom, but it can destroy you, right? When you go into the presence of other, you see the truth of yourself, but that's also the space of creative possibility. It all has this logic of eternity, that where it is what already occurred, what is, and what could be all at the same time. Like these moments where you actually have a certain encounter with the reality, death, the face of the other you can't control. It doesn't simply bring with it implications for your past but for your present and for your future all together. Perhaps sometimes we want to believe that the key revelations can bring with it only one part of time, the past, the present, or the future. Perhaps that's something we want to believe, when really the key revelations in life bring with it all of time, all together. And memory is that participation, that spirit of eternity. The key revelations have implications for the whole of life, not just a segment of time. And I think there could be a temptation to avoid that, to avoid other people for those moments. But you did not give into that temptation, Thomas Jockin, and no one can take that from you. I will give it to Christian here, and then if anyone has any final things to say this evening, please. Christian, thank you for being here, sir.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for sharing, Thomas. I appreciate that. Yeah, I agree. It's good to have people to share those moments with. The crashes of life. Yeah, I had a whole bunch of things I was going to say, but we've ended with Seth and Thomas on the topics of eternity and death and God. And I think those are stronger notes to let linger as we bring the session to a close. So I'm going to put my other thoughts aside for this conversation, maybe come back to them in a future one. No, Thomas, it's fine. That's the nature of coming together. No need to apologize. I mean, I get the privilege of getting to encounter something I didn't expect with your sharing, Thomas. And I'm thankful for it. I guess I'll say this, and Thomas, you were saying about how there's always a person there whenever, if these were your exact words, whenever something is known, or something appears, right? And there's a sense of wholeness I have about myself, like there's a unity or a singularity to myself. And that singularity has the flavor of wholeness to it because I have a sense of my whole one self. And yet I don't have that, I can't access that wholeness but by way of my singularity, which has to exist in relation to a greater plurality and a greater otherness. And this is how when I have to think about love, it's how I think about love. It's this, I want to say something like vibration that happens when the sense of wholeness I have in myself, including that experience I have of the other, is felt as a kind of unity, and yet also a sense of otherness at the same time, right? And these, as kind of like distilled abstract ideas, they seem to contradict each other. What does it mean to have a sense of the otherness and the oneness at the same time? And I think this is the limits of logic. But in the felt sense, these two this impossible coming together of otherness and singularness, I think is what is as close as I can get to expressing in a kind of logical, abstract way what love is, right? And so whenever we have opportunities to feel that simultaneous oneness and otherness is the opportunity for love. And I think it is exactly when we lose something that its otherness is most apparent to us. When it's still with us, it's the boundary is maybe a bit fuzzier, but in its absence, it's very clear, right? I think that's as best as I can put it. But thank you so much for everyone's shares today. And thank you, Daniel, as always. A great happy new year to everyone. I'll share one of my New Year's resolutions, which is patience. Speaking of eternity, I've decided I need to spend more time reflecting on the eternal and that sense that you're talking about, Seth, of like the perfection in the incomplete and the limited, that transcendental, whatever, perfect. Yeah, I'll just say perfection as a means to find more patience within myself, right? Yes, maybe I feel some dissatisfaction here, but at a deeper level, that sense, that connection with the eternal and the perfect is my grounding for my experience, not the dissatisfaction. That's all I've got. Thank you, guys.
Divine. Thank you, Christian. Wonderful. I will just say some closing things. And thank you all for being here on this New Year's. I think patience is indeed worthy to practice and meditate upon and get better at it. It's funny you say that, and it brings Seth's work to mind. I think about how I'm patient, and then I see what a hurry I am to get up the stairs, that I don't use my whole foot to walk up it, and how often I rarely use my entire body. And I say this because it kind of gets a bit to the Krafel, how often I don't use my entire body to pick up an object, or I'm not fully present when I take a walk. And I think about how those forms of patience are actually really important as a kind of Krafel move that we've been talking about, because those are all the little things that are part of the stewardship, to reference Clayton's tremendous paper, that I have on my body that has in a feedback loop with me that actually has a big kind of impact on how I approach the world and how I see the world and how I'm available to the world and how I attend to it. But I think also, I love what you were saying on love and also eternity. I do think there is an interesting way in which these kind of moments of eternity, these kind of revelations of eternity, which I do think patience is kindling us to, it has a big impact on how we see the sky tomorrow. It has a big impact on how what we see is in front of us. Like, and I think also what Jockin is saying, these moments of memory that feel like eternity, it kind of says to you how you're going to see the world tomorrow. Like, if you were not virtuous in the relationship, then everywhere you look tomorrow can be a reminder of those choices of rejection that you chose to submit to, right? Now, you may, in seeing that, then choose to be different, so the memory can have future implications, right? But moments of these kind of breakthrough of eternity, they suggest how you see and what you will see. And the more we can get aligned with this sense of eternity, I think we have more control over how we see things and what we see. And I actually think it is tied a lot to love as this indeterminacy, because we really very rarely see what's in front of us as the bothness that you're describing, that it's present and not present at the same time. I think love, when you fall in love with someone, that becomes, and this is a Dante notion, that is the still point in a T.S. Eliot way, in which you are learning and experience the disposition that is to be brought to all things. But if you can't do it in a person, you're not going to be able to bring it to all things. And if you could do it to all things, it actually is too closed, right? You have to have it orbiting the personal to keep it at the right openness between the map and the territory, the right kind of mean between those things. But the reason why there's an incompleteness is because they can surprise you, they can hurt you, they can say things you don't understand that you have to work through. That very openness, that very incompleteness that keeps them alive and thus makes it love, also brings with it challenges, which suggests that eternity is challenging, that the ability to actually see the world according to eternity has a challenge to it. And, you know, religious traditions don't always depict eternity as angels sitting on clouds playing harps. There's an eternal battle going on, right, good and evil. There are principalities and fights going on. And there's a way in which to see everything as this kind of incompleteness is to see them as also participating in this conflict, this sort of battle that is going on. But love is one, you know, love is one. It is something one perseveres through that actually thus makes it more beautiful. And I think without that openness, then we just like something. Like pizza, we like pizza because it's complete. It's not this openness. We know what it is and we like it. And basically we can be trained by modernity to not be able to tell the difference between love and like, where there isn't this open-endedness. It is complete, right? Well, again, for good reason, because if it's open-ended, it can surprise you, it can be difficult, and can demand something of you. But I think humans want to have something demanded of them. They long for that, ultimately. Not easy at first, but with work, one can train to it. And that if one chooses, kind of like Michelle was saying, to give yourself over to that process, then I do think you can get those tastes of eternity and everything around you in a way that, that when death does come, will be a testament to, if you so lived, to have eternity tasted around you or not. And so it is important to live in that way. And I think a New Year's resolution toward patience and a New Year's resolution toward that work is a good New Year's resolution indeed. Thank you all. I appreciate it very much. And may you all have a tremendous evening. All the best to 2026.